President Biden signed an executive order Friday to promote economic competition in the United States. The White House says cracking down on anti-competitive practices will ultimately, quote, promote innovation and even faster economic growth. But as Natalie Brand reports, some critics argue businesses don't need government intervention.
President Biden signed a sweeping executive order that he says will increase economic competitiveness in the U.S.
Capitalism without competition isn't capitalism. It's exploitation.
The order includes 72 directives or recommendations encouraging federal agencies to take action on a range of issues, from airline baggage fees to selling hearing aids over the counter. It also takes aim at big business and tech by calling for a restoration in net neutrality rules, a ban on non-compete clauses, and greater antitrust enforcement.
Rather than competing for consumers, they are consuming their competitors. Rather than competing for workers, they're finding ways to gain the upper hand on labor.
Economists say the devil will be in the details, and some groups, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, are already pushing back, criticizing the administration's intervention.
I think the administration has gotten the fundamental facts wrong, and it's leading them down a regulatory path.
Neil Bradley of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce argues the executive order could make it harder for new businesses to get started. Heidi Shearholtz, a chief economist at the Labor Department during the Obama administration, argues the action will empower workers.
Non-compete agreements suppress workers' wages, and so banning them will remove that wage suppressing effect and actually increase workers' wages.
But she notes, as with other executive orders, the federal agencies still need to make the changes, and that could take some time. Natalie Brand, CBS News, the White House.
For more on this, let's bring in Jeff Stein. He's an economics reporter for The Washington Post. Hey there, Jeff. President Biden's executive order includes 72 initiatives. Tell us what some of the more interesting ones entail and which industries are being targeted.
It's pretty amazing the scope of the industries that are involved here. I think, you see really small ones, such as the hearing aid industry, which basically has regulations that prevent hearing aids from being sold over the counter, which drives their prices up by thousands of dollars, to the big tech firms, to large meatpacking and other producers, to the pharma companies, which currently there are prohibitions on importing drugs from Canada, often the same drug at much lower value, lower prices. Americans are not able to access those drugs, and the Biden administration today began the process to allow Americans to do so, which could allow Americans to get much cheaper drugs. But as the segment before noted, there's intense industry opposition. These rules have not been written, and we're expecting to see very heavy mobilization by industry groups in the courts seeking to strike these orders down.
Lots to dig in here. Let's just start with the timing of it. It comes as Google faces a fourth lawsuit over their alleged monopolizing practices. Apple's been sued for similar reasons. How much of an impact did this have on the president's decision to sign this executive order?
This order, I think it's fair to say, has been months, if not years in the making. And we've seen really over the last decade or so increasing concern among Democratic policymakers, Democratic economists, with this idea of corporate consolidation, this idea that a handful of players, much as we saw in the pre-New Deal era, a handful of big players controlling increasing a massive share of the economy. So Google and the tech firms are a key example. You see hundreds of billions of dollars a lot of these companies are valued at. Obviously, Apple crossed the $1 trillion market cap last year. And they don't even really employ that many people. So there's this new argument, this new frontier that's been saying, and a lot of people have been shocked. Joe Biden is not viewed as a particularly progressive left-wing guy over the course of his presidency. But a lot of the people who wrote, as I understand it, and from my reporting, the people who are writing these policies are largely people who come from, Elizabeth Warren's orbit or from, close to the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. Now they're in a position through Biden, and Biden's giving them, his support to issue these very aggressive anti-monopoly measures in response to these concerns.
You know, we've seen Congress try and tackle this before. I want to ask you about, I guess, two very different questions. Why is this coming as executive orders rather than legislative action? And how are consumers potentially going to benefit from this? You mentioned, drug prices and hearing aids. I'm wondering if that gives it sort of the popular support that Congress won't try and challenge this executive order.
I think it's really an open question. I mean, obviously, the White House will scream up and down that this is going to make everything better for consumers. But frankly, what we saw during the pandemic, and a lot of people on the left don't like to hear it, but the companies that were able to survive and thrive in the pandemic were overwhelmingly the large guys. Like Amazon did unbelievably well, in part because as small businesses shut down across the country. I think we ran a poll at one point in the pandemic suggesting that only 20-25% expect to stay open. As Amazon took over during the pandemic, they were able to achieve efficiencies and they were able to cut costs, and that's what helped power their rise. And so the idea of breaking up some of these companies, obviously there's a huge body of progressive economists who say that will, increase competition. But the flip side, the other side of that argument is that having more firms increases inefficiency, increases supply chain frictions, and will make it more difficult for companies to bring down costs. Obviously, Amazon is owned by, Jeff Bezos is the owner of the Washington Post, and a lot of people would be skeptical of that line of argument, but there is that line, even from some economists on the left. Sorry, remind me of your first question.
It was about why this is executive action rather than Congress. But I feel like you've answered that sufficiently, Jeff. In the final moments that I have with you, we heard in Natalie's reporting that there are some groups, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that argue that the Biden administration is heading down a regulatory path by taking this type of action. Why might this be problematic?
Well, I'm not an expert in sort of that area of the law, but I would say, in general, the courts prefer and are more likely to uphold things that are the, will of two branches of government. And in this case, it's really only one. There are a number of things that are part of this executive order that the Biden administration and the White House are hoping will be sort of shored up and substantiated through congressional legislation, particularly legislation to ban non-compete agreements that prevent low-wage fast food workers from switching between firms and bargaining up their wages. That's one we could probably expect legislation to move through Congress this year. But in general, the courts look skeptically at some of this stuff. Trump tried some similar efforts, and they were struck down by the courts. And so while this is an important first step for the antitrust movement, there are a ton of challenges ahead.
All right. Jeff Stein, thank you.
Thanks for having me on.